So I'm going to start recording now. Okay, and we're off. Okay, so we've called this the expert user stream session. We're running three training sessions. One is general information about ASHE for people who've not used it before and who might find this useful to think about this as a potential research tool. The second session is about new users, researchers who might be aware of ASHE or have some, but who are unsure whether it may or may not be suitable for their projects. What we're trying to do in this section stream is we are talking to individuals who are more familiar with ASHE and might have more technical questions about this. This is the first in a series of sessions we'll be running on this. So later sessions will focus, for example, on weighting and on some of the longitudinal elements of this. So this is going to be our first introduction. I'll probably talk for about 15 minutes or so, and then for the next 20 minutes or so, then we'll have questions after that. So we're planning to record this and put this up on the website as part of the documentation. If there are any issues with that, please let me know. Okay, so going through the WED Dataset, and I'm hoping that you can all see the screen. If you can't see, someone let me know, but I'm going to assume everyone can see it. The way you can, thanks Richard. Okay, so the WED project in terms of the core ASHE had 4 activities. So the WED project doesn't involve just ASHE, it involves also the census data and HMRC data, and hopefully bringing in other data sets later. But for now, we're only going to talk about the ASHE data. So for the ASHE, we had 4 key activities. First of all was to acquire all of the ASHE NES data that ONS has and try and make it integrated and accessible. Second thing was to QA those data. Third element was adding useful variables and labels to the core, because sometimes the way that the variables are there is not clear, and there are lots of useful things which should be in the dataset which aren't. And finally, to try and document these things, because there is a lot of documentation out there on ASHE, but not all of it is necessarily accessible to all user groups. So I'm going to talk through each one of those. In terms of acquiring data acquisition, we've been working with ONS for the last 1.5 years. And we've had some success with trying to find out additional variables that exist in the bowels of ONS. Some of those variables actually used to exist some time ago in earlier versions of the data, but they've disappeared from the standard SRS version. What we're hoping now is that we can integrate them and that this will become a new version available for everyone. One of those variables relates to the special arrangements. For those who are aware of this, generally ONS sends out survey forms to organizations and asks the person to fill in that form either electronically or manually, relating to each individual. But for certain types of organizations, usually large ones, they can complete the ASHE form by essentially sending in an Excel spreadsheet downloaded from their payroll data with all the information on it. That's important because we think that there are slightly different response rates for the special arrangements organizations and others. A second variable which we've been looking at is the CERNOL variable. The CERNO, if you recall, is the link to each individual observation in a particular year. What we've now also got is CERNOL in a previous year. That allows us, in theory, to link back to previous to the job in the previous year, which means that for people who have multiple jobs, we should now be able to link the jobs that they're doing this year to whichever is the relevant job in the previous year. And there's a lot more additional geography that's available. Not necessarily new, because of course you could rebuild all of this stuff from the postcode, but it's nice to have it there. There's a lot more information which we're starting to work our way through. We only got our most recent dump of the data a couple of months ago, and we've been working on the CERNO and CERNOL stuff. But there are things that call themselves imputation markers, and there's a marker for low pay verification to verify that this is something that appears to be below the minimum wage. And there are a lot of other variables which ONS holds, but at the moment we don't quite know what they're for. So we will be aiming to acquire those data sets, so we can those variables, we can actually find out what's in them. We suspect that quite a lot of them are input quality assurance variables, so we're quite keen to get hold of them, because that will hopefully give us more information about some of the issues about the accuracy of the data. Okay, second stage is quality assurance. So in terms of the quality assurance, we've been trying to work our way through a list of activities. We have quite a large list of variables and groups of variables that we're going through. For various historical reasons, we started with the main job and the same job work. We've also been looking at the work address on here, because it's been highlighted that there are potential concerns over the reporting of the employee's workplace address. Essentially, when ONS sends out the form, it pre-fills in the employee's workplace with the registered PAYE location, we think, and organizations, respondents are supposed to change this if it's not the actual employee's workplace address. And we suspect that in a notable number of cases, this is not being done, because if you look at the distribution of number of people working at head offices, for example, then ASHE seems to show more people working in head offices than you would expect. Also, if we look at the distance between home and work address, we find that there are further distances between home and work address from people who fill in the individual forms, as opposed to, for example, those who fill in the electronic dump from payroll. We've also been working on cleaning up EMPSTAR, and essentially we're trying to work through a list of quite a long list of variables to make sure that each of the variables in there is something that we're either confident about or that we've done something about to make it useful. And I'll show you a couple of the ways we're trying to document the changes as we look at the website later. Okay, we've also spent quite a time looking at the sampling on here. ASHE, as you know, is supposed to be a 1% sample of the people in employment, but it only typically retrieves about 2/3 of that, about 0.67%. Attrition is a lot higher than other sources like the LFS and Understanding Society would suggest, looking at the rates of who's in the survey 1 year and whether they're in the next year. We discovered through this that ONS uses a form of quote sampling. I mean, it does send out survey forms to everyone on the full 1% of the ASHE population that is working. But because ASHE is delivered to an extremely tight timetable, with the survey forms going out in April, going out in March for a survey week in April, and then aiming to get the data in, collected, cleaned, and reported on by early autumn, means that when they come to around July, August, if they've got a reasonable number of samples, then essentially they treat that as that's the basic data set. They do some continual chasing, but the main data collection is seen as largely finished by that point. So that does obviously lead to a potential incentive to non-respond, although this is a survey data collected under Statistics of Trade Act, so means that employers have a statutory requirement to respond. There is also an incentive to delay responding if you think you might not be able to and might not have to fill in the form later. When we've looked at the the response levels amongst businesses, by comparing the responses in ASHE to the distribution of businesses in the business structure database, we're reasonably confident that this is non-random response. There are differences between size and type and sector of organisation. So, for example, the public sector tends to be very good at responding. It's pretty much the numbers in ASHE are what we would expect from the business structure database. In other organisations, particularly the private sector, particularly small organisations, then there seems to be quite a lot of missing data. There are some sector variations. It's not clear where they come up from. There doesn't appear to be a regional dimension to this, other than the regional dimension, which is already embodied in the fact that, for example, public sector is not evenly distributed across the UK. We also look to see across time as to whether the same organisations tend to not respond, and there is a strong suggestion that there are lots of repeat offenders. What that means is that we are reasonably confident that there is non-response amongst particular types of businesses. In terms of response to that, there are two responses for our data collection for creating for creating the data set. Is we are currently constructing cross-sectional weights and longitudinal weights. So there are really cross-sectional weights on there, which ONS constructs based upon the sampling criterion. What we're now trying to do, with work being led by John Forth and Lucy Stokes and Van, of course, on the call, is we're trying to look at new cross-sectional weights, which will also accommodate this known difference between organisation types. We're also trying to see whether we construct longitudinal weights. We tried doing this a while ago in a previous project, but now we know an awful lot more about the dropout rates. So we're trying to, again, with John, Lucy, and Van, trying to see if we can construct meaningful longitudinal weights for this as well. So that will be one way of responding to the sampling issues. The other thing is, because we do think there seem to be differences by reasonably standard variables, so size, sector, type, then if you are conditioning on these variables in, for example, in regression analysis, then it may well be that that's sufficient to minimize the bias that might come out of here. Okay, adding new variables and labels. There's quite a lot of new variables we've added to it, particularly from the Low Pay Commission, where it's the basis for a lot of our work. So they use a particular definition of wage for their calculations. We've added in low paying industries and occupations they've identified, and minimum wage workers. There are different definitions. So there's the LPC definition of what a minimum wage worker is, which is minimum wage plus 5 pence. There's our definition, which is minimum wage up to the next 10 pence boundary. Can't remember, there might be a third one. And we've also added in survey dates, Easter, minimum wage bands. A lot of the ONS variables are not that useful, like, for example, sex being defined as 1 and 2, which we've now got a new variable in, which is called male and a 0-1 or female 0-1, which is slightly more meaningful. We've put in a longitudinal job marker, which is only in the WED files at the moment, but we're hoping that what we're doing here will enable a new version of the standard ASHE SRS files to be available. Okay. Okay, so documentation, we have a website, wagedynamics.com. I'll show you that in a moment. And what we're trying to put up there is all the stuff as we generate it. So it's been empty for quite a while, if you did look at it some months ago, but we've been revamping it because we're now finally getting to the stage where we have documentation to put out there. That's partly why we're doing these training sessions now, is because you've got to the stage we have things to show people. So there we'll be putting out there the descriptions of the data creation code, all our QA reports, user guides, references to other stuff. We're still developing it, so comments are welcome. And the code and supporting files will be available definitely in the SRS. We don't know if they'll be available outside because it's not so easy to maintain, but we're trying to make all this as accessible as possible. And just very briefly to show you what we've got on the Wage Dynamics site, which hopefully you can all see now. This is the our main website. What I'd like to highlight on here for today, we've talked about is under data documentation. We have got data and variable descriptions, data construction, and quality assurance on here. So the data and variable description covers, we've done a quick ASHE start guide for people who are new to ASHE. We've got a sample questionnaire up there and links to all the other questionnaires hosted by other organizations, and we're starting to put methodological papers on there as well. on the data construction, then what we'll be putting on here will be the detailed breakdown of how all the code that pulls this together works, so that if you want to go through and see exactly what we've done in terms of, for example, creating the main job variables, then that should be here. The English language versions are going on here. The raw code will be available in the SRS. Okay, and under QA, this is where we're putting, at the moment this is just listed because if you've only got a few, later on we'll turn these into a bit more organized form, but essentially we're putting down our documents here for each of the elements of the QA work that we're doing. Okay, and I think that is it. So I'll stop there and invite questions. Okay, any questions? Richard?
Thanks, Felix. That's great. Could you say something about the years which are covered by your ASHE? So are you just going back to 2004 or before then?
Good point. So we're dealing with the ASHE, which ONS treats as 97 onwards. But of course, the 97 to 2003 is just basically NES with recalculated weights put on top of it. What we've also just taken delivery of is the NES files from 1986 to 1997, and those should have a consistent ID added to them, so that in theory we can look all the way back to 1986 for people who are there. We haven't managed to check this out yet. ONS have tried to put these IDs on there. They do suggest we be cautious about them, because one of the problems was prior to 2004 the full national insurance number wasn't held. It was felt that the check digit then particularly wasn't needed, and it turns out it was. So there is some inconsistency in the, or at least there are some concerns about the consistency of the pre-2004 data. But if you're happy to work with that, then that does give you stuff now, hopefully going back to 1986. We haven't integrated the ASHE files yet, but given that most of the data is the same, most of the variables are the same, then we should be able to run the same code as we currently got. Most of the new discoveries also about the new variables only go back to the 97 as well, though. They're consistent with the ASHE coding.
Okay, so basically back to 97 is kind of the
97 seems reliable. So 2004 was fine. 97 seems reliable. 1986 to 97, in theory, is there, but we're not sure yet how well it is. In other words, how many gaps there might be and how many inconsistencies. Yeah.
And is the data from 75 to 85 lost, or?
No, it's in the panel data sets, but the panel data sets have a completely different indexing structure. So at some point in the future, what we'd like to do would be to see whether we can, with the fact that we've got the NES year files now with a consistent number on it, and then we've got the panel data files, then we might be able to use that to actually go back and pick out those ones from 75 to 85. The only thing is the panel data sets that we have only have the main job, so there'll be a slight restriction in the data set, but it should be possible to go back and find those 75 to 85 ones. But yeah, so okay. So just to clarify, the 86 to 97, that they've been re-indexed by ONS because they have access to the Ninos, which we don't have. So the 75 to 85 will be us trying to reconstruct it from the panel data sets.
Thanks, Felix.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Edwin.
Thanks, Felix. That was really useful. Just a question, because I didn't quite follow. Could you explain what advantage the cross-sectional weights the WED project is developing will have above and beyond the current ones provided by the ONS?
Because I think the ONS weights are based upon the personal characteristics of the individuals. So ONS sees this as this is individual data. So when it looks at the number of people in the data set, then it sees, okay, they're like the LFS. So it weights to the LFS, which is weighted to the census. Now, what we're concerned about is that there is a clear or it seems a fairly clear response issue amongst businesses. So what John and Lucy and Van are doing is trying to look at that and seeing whether they can incorporate that as a better weighting mechanism. It may be something that if you're primarily interested in doing regression type of analysis, then this may not be relevant for you, because the conditioning that you use on having sort of sector variables and industry variables is sufficient to mop up the industry differences. We don't quite know yet. So as part of that, then what we're trying to do is look at the analysis with and without weighting and see how it affects things. But we're hoping that by the end of January, we'll be ready to do the next one of these sessions will be on that. So because we realise it's an important thing.
Great, thanks. That helps. And do you know, have you spoken to ONS about how the kind of whether those weights would ever be, whether your weights would ever replace the ONS weights, the kind of process going forward on it?
I don't know whether they replace them. I mean, in a way, it's consistent with what ONS does. It often has multiple levels of weights. Some build nodes. So all the ONS weights are constructed around, you have your initial design weight, and then you adjust that with the actual response weight. So it's response rate. So you have your design weights, and then you have your achieved sample weights, and then they might do some other tweaking on that. And I think what we're doing is trying to add an additional factor onto that to represent the business distribution on there. So I mean, what we're the aim for this is that everything that we do, and the reason why we're trying to write up all the documentation, is that all of this is written down and sustainable, so that someone else can run the code and do all of this in future. So as far as possible, then this should all be coded, and someone else could do this as well.
Great, thanks a lot.
Okay. Hi, Thomas.
Hi, thanks a lot. That was really useful. I had another question about the cross-sectional weights, which was whether it would be possible to use some of HMRC's data to both do a better job at matching the individual characteristics and the firm characteristics. So for example, I think you could probably fill in some of the missing data using the PAYE data. So you won't be able to get hours and hourly pay, but you could get some pay information and some information about the characteristics of the firms. So that might help to improve the cross-sectional weights. And then the other quick question was about, was just whether you know when this might be available on SRS?
Yeah, so I'll do with the second question first. That I'm trying to sort of complete the writing up the coding. What we plan is to make the coding available to others through the SRS, so that we can share the static code which we use to generate this, along with the documentation. And I'm a bit behind time. I hope to have this for beginning of December, but it's now going to be in the beginning of January. But we're happy to circulate the code and the documentation to get feedback on that, because a lot of the stuff it's not anything particular that we've got out of ONS. It is just the time to clean up some of the ASHE stuff on there. So the WED file itself, we're hoping that we can persuade ONS that this will become more of the standard ONS deliverable on here, but that will be a second stage negotiation once we've shown how it works. Going back to the HMRC weighting issue, then yeah, this is really important, getting the HMRC data through. I mean, one of the reasons for HMRC data is because it tells us the direct research value, because it tells us what people are doing when they're not observed in ASHE, and it tells us what they're doing in between April to April, and it gives us information about whether they might be self-employed as well. So there's lots of value in it, but we realized over the last few months that one of the key things that we'll be looking at for the HMRC data is to try and look at the sampling issue more effectively, because we've asked for the entire ASHE population of HMRC data, not the ASHE sample. So that should give us an idea of who actually should be selected and then we can see who's actually responds back on this, and then hopefully we can do the that will have the link to allow us to do the analysis of the businesses, so we should get a much better sense of where the gaps are in there. So that's going to be really important. Unfortunately, at the moment, we're looking at the data delivery is going to be the end of January for HMRC, and that's the data delivery. So it's going to be some months after that before we can probably get useful findings on that. So in the meantime, this is what we're doing is trying to work on the ASHE only stuff and the working at ASHE and the BSD to try and create these weights.
Great, thanks a lot.
Okay. Hello, Alice.
Hi Felix, thanks. This is so useful. I'm fine. I've been using ASHE for the past year, so it's really useful to know that you've done a lot of QA checks, and I'll look forward to the reports. One thing that I want, and I've been using ASHE to do, is kind of observe movements in the labour market, so see what people do and how they move between jobs. And I work in DFE, so I'm trying to add some kind of training data in this. So I wanted to know, no one that I could find had done any longitudinal analysis of ASHE before. So I wanted to know what you've done in that space and what you're thinking about in terms of the weights that you're looking at.
So you mean in terms of think about the longitudinal weights that we're putting on there? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we're putting longitudinal weights on there because one of our core research outputs is looking at looking at wage progression generally, low pay transitions in particular, and so understanding that longitudinal profile is really quite important for us. I forgot what the question was. It was about the weights. So.
Sorry, it wasn't very specific. Yeah, what you're considering when creating those weights, what it is you're trying to do. I
don't know. Van might want to come in here because she used to be more closely involved with this. But so it's John, Lucy, Van have been doing this, and I think what we're trying to look at is we're taking information from the LFS and the Understanding Society in terms of what we know about more reliably about people's transitions into different work stages, and using that to say, okay, this is to calibrate the ASHE transitions, because we seem to have many more ASHE transitions than out of ASHE than is feasible. I mean, it's something like a 25% dropout rate, which is much higher than it should be. I don't know, Van, do you want anything to add on there?
I think we use the annual population surveys to do the attritions because we think that annual population survey is more reliable.
So it's we're using the APS longitudinal as to calibrate, yeah, I don't know what that's within that, and I can't remember. I think is it being done on a year-by-year basis?
Yeah. So we observe that in the annual population surveys, whether they are in the employee job in the following years. So and we use that to calculate for the ASHE.
Yeah. So I can't tell you. I'm afraid I can't tell you much more specifically on this because my colleagues are the ones who are the experts on this. But we're hoping that by the end of January we'll be able to do one of these presentations just on that particular issue of what we've done with the weights and things. So we thought we would spend time covering that.
Great, thanks so much.
Okay.
I think you can find out the slide that John already prepared and presented in the WePack on our website, because there are some methodologies slide back on the website. So maybe that's kind of like the first.
Yeah.
Way to go, I think.
Yeah, let's just make sure it's on there. So more conference presentations. So under conference presentations should be, and yeah, longitudinal. If I just share my screen, can you all see that?
Yep.
Okay, so I think this is the one. Van, is that right? ASHE longitudinal attrition. So that's more about analysing the problems, but also how we're planning to tackle it on here.
That's perfect. Thank you. I'll have a look.
Okay, super. Right. Okay. Any other questions?
Maybe I could just, so when you get the HMRC data, have you thought about whether that might actually change the structure of the data from an annual panel to something more complex, or are you planning to stick with one observation per year?
I'd imagine that we would probably want to summarize it into one observation per year to make it manageable, but we want to maintain the full detail because we want to be able to see what someone's doing if they've got multiple stages and if they're working for the same employer going back to them. So I think that for the sort of analysis, then it's going to be really helpful to have something which maps onto the annual data, which says basically you've got the really detailed ASHE information, and now here's all the stuff they're doing in between time as well. So we know whether they were, for example, continually employed or continually employed but with multiple employers, or that. So putting some of these markers on would then help us to understand some of that. The trouble is that the HMRC data is great for telling us what they're doing. It's limited on some of the variables that it has because it's only got total earnings and things, but so we're going to need to balance both of those things, but that gives us everything that people are doing. So if we treat that as one sort of data structure, and a second structure will be to add on to the ASHE the detailed the sort of summary of what they'll be doing over the year in terms of what we might think is useful. And again, we'll see this as part of the core of
and they're going to give you the records for everyone whose national insurance number falls within the sampling frame of ASHE.
This is what we've, yes, this is what I was, because otherwise, if we only get the ones who are in the ASHE sample, then we're still in the same position. We don't know. I mean, what we could do is ask for everyone who's ever been in the ASHE sample. That would also be another option. That would give us a wider grouping. But what we really want is we know what the criteria are. So ONS and HMRC have worked together that they've created all this is done with encrypted national insurance numbers, and we don't even see the encrypted ones. So all this is done in the background, but they've identified the group, the population, and then what we're hoping is then we'll get this population, and then we can see what the ASHE sample is.
And will that just be for the most recent year, or can they provide it for?
If it goes back to 2014, so we're hoping to get multiple years. I keep saying we're hoping to because one of the experiences of this project is until the data sits on our desk, we don't really know what we're getting. So even the drops of ASHE of the NAS have been quite surprising when they come through. What's in there? So we're being a bit cautious. This is what we've asked for. This is what we think is coming through, and that's what everyone says is coming through. But until it actually arrives in our web space, then our research space, then we don't quite know.
That would be very exciting.
It will, yeah.
It would be a real transform the data, I think, possibly.
I think so. It'll give us enormous value because we know that's the big problems with ASHE is the gaps as to what people aren't doing, but we hadn't appreciated before we started this project quite how high the attrition rate was on here, and how this might seem to be non-random on as well. And we certainly hadn't looked at the business response rates to this. So that is going to be important as well as say direct research interest, but for telling us about the ASHE as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? No. Okay. Oh, just one last one from Daniel.
Sorry to jump in there. Just on that potential linkage with the HMRC data, are there any plans to also link to data which will contain sort of firm characteristics as well?
Well, if from that data, then we should be able to link to the business structure database. So that's got the minimal information about firms, and so you do have an enterprise reference number on the ASHE dataset itself. So what we're not planning on doing, or what we haven't asked for in HMRC download this time, is business tax records, because they don't relate to the individual. So So it's only the PAYE and the self-employment data that we link. So we're looking very much at an individual level. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Cheers.
Okay. And of course, in the longer term, we are exploring DWP linkages as well, because that's the other missing gap between what people are doing when they're not working or not self-employed.
Yes. Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and then I'm going to take that as a sign to wrap up. Thank you all very much for attending. Thanks for your questions. If you have any more information, then please, if you have any want more information, then please get in touch with us either directly through the website, right down the road waving a flag. Okay, all right. Thank you all very much, and I hope you all have a fine holiday season. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much, Felix.
Thank you.
Thanks, Felix.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.
Felix.